Good morning. I would like to ask you a question about Egypt. What, how we can force the United Nations Human Rights Committee, really, after all the reports from Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch about the violation of the human rights in Egypt, how we can force them to send investigative committee or fact-finding committee to the prisons in Egypt, in your opinion? And we submitted in November 11 as an organization, Ghorbah, we submitted a full report about some of these violations with cooperation with Amnesty International.
Yes, I'm not sure it's the United Nations you want to focus on, because although certainly the United Nations Human Rights Committee, the Committee on Human Rights, and even the more political United Nations Human Rights Council can deal with the situation in Egypt and is dealing with it to a limited extent, Egypt is also part of a regional body called the African Union. And the African Union has a body called the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. The African Commission deals with cases, and it has probably more authority than the United Nations in that when it deals with those cases, it deals with them with African countries that are closer to Egypt, that Egypt depends on for its daily life, essentially. And that commission has not a bad record of having integrity in its decisions. There have been dozens of cases now. I know of about 24 cases, one that I filed on behalf of Qatrat al-Shatter, who I represent, but there are other cases that have been filed on behalf of other Egyptians to the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. And those cases will be considered by that body, and they will then give an opinion on it. An opinion that, in fact, the Commission itself has said they believe is legally binding, and it is an indirect sense because it is explaining the obligations of the state under the African Charter, which is a legally binding obligation. Technically, the Commission's decisions are more opinions or recommendations than they are legally binding judgments. Egypt is not a party to the African Court of Human and or Justice and Human Rights, I should say, but they are a party to the Commission. What is perhaps even more important, though, under the Commission, there is in Article 58 of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, there is a procedure whereby if people like yourselves or others bring a number of violations to the attention of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, and those violations indicate that there is a massive and widespread violation of human rights, so a very serious problem in a country related to human rights, then under Article 58 of the Charter, the Commission can refer this to the heads of state and government of the African Union. Now, as you may know, the heads of state and government of the African Union actually suspended Egypt earlier on, and then Egypt worked its way back in part because that is a political body. So right now it's quite difficult to raise Egyptian human rights violations in that body directly. Any state could do that, but they're not likely to do it because Egypt sits in that body. But what individuals could do are raise these cases before the African Commission on Human and People's Rights and get this African Union body to raise it with the African Union heads of government and states. And then they have to consider it, because they can ignore you or I doing it. They can even ignore 1 or 2 states raising it, but they cannot ignore the Commission because it's in the Charter. It says that they have to accept this from the Commission, and the Commission has this authority to do that. That's one of their bodies. And then they have to deal with this situation of massive violations of human rights in the country. So I would suggest that you should maybe focus some attention, although there are people focusing attention, on the African Commission. If you want to focus it on the United Nations, the human rights, the Committee on Human Rights under the International Covenant of International Civil and Political Rights is one possible body. but more likely you will get more substance or more reaction if you raise it in the political body of the Human Rights Council. And any NGO that has ECOSOC status, that's accredited to the United Nations, can raise it. They can raise it with each of the special mandate holders that would be relevant. And there's several. There's a mandate holder on summary arbitrary executions. There's a mandate holder on torture. There's a mandate holder on refugees and displaced people. Perhaps most importantly, although less thought of, there's a mandate holder on an equitable and democratic international order. And every single person in Egypt had their right to participate in government, which is a right in Article 25 of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, also a right in Articles 13 and 20 of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. You have, as an Egyptian, the right to participate in the government of your country, just like I have it in the countries of which I hold nationality. That right is prima facie violated whenever you have a military coup. Even Sisi's right to participate in the government himself, the person who is now ruling the country, had his right violated by himself, by the coup that he participated in. Because a military coup is an unconstitutional change of government and is a de facto violation of those rights. But these are things that I think are better raised in the UN system directly with the Human Rights Council. And it won't be easy because Egypt has a lot of sway in that council. But there are other states that are willing to raise it, that have sometimes raised it, and I think that they need much more encouragement from civil society to raise it.
Then we have to rely more on NGOs who will deal with that, or lawyers who can raise it in the United Nations.
Well, I think mainly NGOs.
NGOs.
I think you're better off, if you want to raise individual cases, going to the African Commission.
Okay.
And you have to choose, because the African Commission will not accept something that has been decided by another body, and the Human Rights Committee will not accept something that is under consideration by another body. So you have to choose, and I think for individual cases, and even for putting them together, well, that can be done at different bodies. I think that it's legitimate and probably more wiser to raise them before the African Union body of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. But you still could raise issues within the United Nations in the procedures under the United Nations Human Rights Council, which are not judicial or even quasi-judicial. Although they apply international law, those are political procedures that will raise the awareness about this as a larger issue rather than an individual case.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, and good luck.